I think racism in any public space, when you have power and you have folks without power, you see its ugly head.
Racism is kind of embedded in our understandings of the way institutions work.
When we talk about white comfort, we're talking about the difference between the quality of a commuter bus or even a BRT versus a neighborhood bus.
In the United States, race has profoundly shaped public transit. The racial stratification of many transit systems today can be traced to the historical moment when these agencies were created. In the 1960s and 70s, many transit systems were on the verge of collapse following the mass exodus of white Americans from cities to suburbs.
There was a real crisis in terms of seeing the existing transit in the United States feeling like it was on the verge of extinction.
At the same time, there was a growing awareness that highways built after World War II had failed to solve congestion and that suburban residents needed a transportation alternative.
Essentially, a deal got made to say, we're going to put these things together and we're going to create a transit agency which will both rescue our current transit system and then build new transit to serve as an alternative to that congestion.
Transit riders at the time were increasingly Black and brown city residents. The target audience for congestion relief was largely white suburbanites.
In people's minds, each of these missions sort of had their own target audience, and that difference had a real racial dynamic to it.
Notions about who those riders are and the quality they deserve continue to inform transit operations today. It's often expressed in terms of captive and choice riders. You can also think of it as planning for white comfort. Where do we see these disparities show up in modern transit systems? Most prominently in transit amenities, service quality, and policing strategies.
There's a clear difference between the amenities we encounter in communities experiencing disparity versus communities that have been more historically privileged.
Building a commuter rail system, the expectation is that every single stop is going to have shelters, every single stop is going to have seating. And then when you look at the local bus network in that same city, you see that some of the stops are just a sign and nothing else.
At U.S. transit agencies that operate both bus and rail service, bus facilities get far less investment than rail facilities, less than a tenth as much spending on a per-trip basis.
The systems which tend to be the highest percentage low-income riders and the highest percentage people of color are the system which get the lowest quality amenities.
This non-approach to bus stops really comes down to racism and neglect.
In 2014, Minneapolis's Metro Transit was criticized for expanding light rail to the suburbs without improving the bus experience. In response, the agency created the Better Bus Stop program.
They specifically funneled investments to Black and brown communities based on recommendations from riders in those neighborhoods.
This program added over 135 shelters in racially concentrated areas of poverty. In these communities, roughly 2/3 of bus boardings are now at stops with shelters, similar to the rate of the whole system. Disparities in service quality are another legacy of racism in transit planning. Many commuter rail agencies formed at the height of white flight and continue to operate in ways that exclude Black and brown riders.
The genesis of commuter rail systems is really narrowly defining who a commuter is. And so often that is white collar, often white workers who are upper income, who work a 9-to-5 job.
This pattern shows up in nearly every U.S. city with a commuter rail system, but is particularly pronounced in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago.
You really have a bifurcated system in some places where poor folks are taking a bus to another bus when there is a stop in their community, but the schedule doesn't align with their lives and with their work, or the prices are too high.
In Chicago, Metra's expensive fares and infrequent service have left many Southside residents behind. Riders who can afford a trip on Metra can access 35,000 more jobs than riders who can only afford a trip on CTA.
Metra service has really been designed around making sure that people from suburban areas can zoom into downtown Chicago as easily and quickly as possible, while sort of ignoring the inner city areas that represent so many of the stations, especially on the south side of the city.
So one of the things that we discovered as we looked at transit opportunities across the county is that people in our south suburbs had the longest commutes of anybody in the region.
93% of residents on the south side of Chicago identify as Black. Thanks to advocacy from the Metro Electric Coalition, Cook County is funding fare reductions to make the Metro Electric line more affordable.
Our Fair Transit Pilot is a 3-year program in which we've invested more than $30 million. We reduced the fares on Metro Electric and Rock Island lines to CTA fares, which is $2.50.
Cook County recognized that Black residents were being left behind and directed money towards a targeted fare relief program. Another legacy of suburbanization and white flight from cities is aggressive policing on transit.
Many of the social problems that we're dealing with in cities have become concentrated in sites of public transportation.
Since the 1990s, many transit agencies have relied on a form of policing known as broken windows to maintain order within their systems.
So what happens is transit police, now they look for the broken windows equivalent on public transit systems. What does that look like? That looks like graffiti. That looks like fare evasions.
They have this kind of zero tolerance mindset, and this has driven huge numbers of people into the criminal justice system.
Studies from across the country have shown that fare enforcement disproportionately targets Black and brown riders, and that people of color face harsher penalties when they are stopped. Some transit systems are taking steps to reduce discrimination in policing. After a BART police officer killed Oscar Grant in 2009, the agency has made major policing reforms.
What we have done is look back, not only at the data, but the ways in which we've policed poor people, the ways that we have policed fare evaders, the ways in which that we have responded to crimes.
Taking an honest look at the data, BART found that Black men were being disproportionately stopped on their system. And as of 2018, 60% of BART police use of force incidents involved Black riders, despite the fact that only 10% of the system's riders are Black. In 2020, BART launched an unarmed ambassador program to reduce the number of police stops and increase referrals to social services.
These ambassadors and the additional social work staff are going to be on our trains with referrals, right? And not guns.
Creating a unit dedicated to addressing quality of life offenses frees up police officers' time to focus on preventing and addressing violent crime. Confronting the legacy of racism involves acknowledging past mistakes.
It is an absolute must that transit agencies do acknowledge decisions that they've made in the past that have harmed their riders.
One of the most harmful functions of racism is erasure. So if we're unwilling to talk about it, we are actively participating in the erasure of the negative experiences that folks are having as a result of racism.
It also entails investing in programs designed to close gaps in outcomes for Black and brown riders.
Commuter rail agencies and transit agencies writ large, really have to look at how they can repair damage that's been done in the past. And it really is through affirmative investments. It is through putting money behind all of the talk of equity.
Transit decision makers must acknowledge that the status quo is inequitable.
We just need to realize all of this is happening on top of a history in which racism has been a big part. We need to see how we can affirmatively undo some of that past and current racism by making better decisions and running better transit systems.
Eliminating racism in transit isn't about calling out individuals. It's about identifying and disrupting the mechanisms that perpetuate existing disparities.
We cannot decouple our past from our present. But what we can do is identify these mechanisms in a way that empowers everybody at the table.
If we get it right, we will have transit systems that can really benefit everybody.
Hard work, but totally possible.